guess, to use a very Hong Kong word, to echo what our guest Werner Bickley was mentioning, one always kind of wonders about what story to tell, to introduce oneself, and it usually depends upon the audience you're with in the room. And the audience today, people I consider myself friends of and pretty close to, because we've shared a lot of time together, not only individually but collectively as well. What story to tell? What do I do? My short biodata, as would be said in Southeast Asia, as opposed to my CV. I'm an associate professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, and when people ask me what I teach, it's just like when you're a graduate student, they kind of ask you what your main research field is, and it kind of changes depending on who's asking you every time. So I've changed what I say I teach. I used to say I teach post-World War II American literature and American culture. I now say that I teach, and which is what I do teach, I teach literary journalism, also known as gonzo journalism or first-person journalism, which is very much, or partly what Cemetery Miscue or Cemetery Miscue is. Basically, journalism in the first person, where we don't, like the anthropologists discovered at around the same time that Einstein discovered that, you know, the observer becomes the observed. So why not include the observer in the narrative as well, and not disguise subjectivity as objectivity. So I'd like teaching that to students, because there's always an official narrative which is often culturally determined by a privileged group, often classist, often top-down. If you're using Marx's now outdated idea of the social classes, as opposed to bottom-up. So what I was trying to do in this text, and what I try to do with my students, is get them to question official narratives and show how official narratives change. And what's most compelling for me when I think of history as historiography is what's compelling is what the historian or historiographer leaves out of the narrative, the gaps. And I think a big gap in the Hong Kong context, which is the reason why I wanted to write this book, are the underworld or underclass narratives of illegal South Asians. So this text is about a Pakistani who arrived in Hong Kong at the tender age of 17, and he was a middle-class Pakistani, a little bit overweight, never been hungry a day in his life, and within a few months of being in Hong Kong, he had sold his passport. He had worn his shoes to the point where he could not wear them anymore, worn them down, and he was sleeping on the Star Ferry, covered by newspapers, and eating McDonald's, which is not halal. So eating haram, non-kosher food, if I can use the Jewish word, from the garbage cans. But he had a story to tell. And I realized he had that story because I would spend a bit of time with him, because he was a neighbor on Llama Island. And the story came out in bits and pieces because I would spend some time with him, sometimes to partake in a substance that he was dealing illegally, but it wasn't really about smoking hash with him. It was really about the narrative, the stories he started to tell, and I decided I wanted to record him and get his story in his words, which are compelling because I'm not trying to reappropriate his words, which is a problem when you try to speak for the other, because you're often not enfranchising but disenfranchising that other and putting his or her experiences through your own lens. And he had been in Hong Kong for 10 years at that point, so he had his international brand of English. He'd learned English in the streets of Hong Kong. He had also learned a fair bit of Cantonese, Bahasa Indonesia, and Tagalog. in his underworld travels, and he was representative of a big community of people, all of whom go by the name in solidarity, Shaji. There's not just one Shaji. And he was known by me and is still known by me as Shaji. I don't actually even know his official birth name. But in this community, they traffic in ID cards and passports. So even though he was here illegally, he left a few times to go home to visit his family, because he had 5 or 6 different ID cards. Or if a friend gets arrested because he doesn't have an ID card, and we know in the Hong Kong context, you are more likely to get questioned by a police officer and ask for your ID, which is legal to ask anybody for an ID card. But I have never been asked. But that community is often asked, and they often don't want to open the wallet because there are 6 IDs, so they say, I have no ID. Go to the police station, and then Shaji would arrive with... So let me backtrack a little bit. So Shaji's story is one that is shared by a fairly large Pakistani and Indian subcontinent community. What he found out after months of poverty here and destitution, he had met some people in a park. He recognized their accent. The Urdu they spoke was quite, and the Punjabi they were speaking was, he knew they were Punjabi like himself from the Pakistan side, and he recognized the accent as one near his, and it turns out they were far relatives of his. And he realized that he could make money and live well by being a hashish dealer, which is what he started doing. But for me, spending time with him, it was interesting because I'd sit with him and people would show up at his door to procure the substances they wanted, and he did do far more illicit substances that will not be legalized in certain states in the U.S., as is happening now with marijuana. And is legal in certain countries anyways. But they didn't see him as a friend. They just saw him as a medium, as a vehicle to procure substances. But for me, I always made sure to have a tin of beer with me to give him, and we would talk. And I came up with the idea that I should record him and tell his story, because it became very apparent to me very quickly that he's a very smart man. One does not need to have a university education to be a very smart man. When I think of Shaji, really I think of someone like Truman Capote, who is not queer. A very masculine Truman Capote who has an excellent memory and is a wonderful storyteller even in youth. So the way this text worked is as a mode of literary journalism, or first-person journalism. I sat with him and just recorded his story in 7 or 8 sittings, each ranging between an hour and 2. And it's interesting, as his story became closer and closer to the present, the first half of which gives us an idea of his middle-class life in Pakistan, and his family members and his sister and his brothers, or his brother and his 2 sisters. As we glean more about him in Hong Kong and it comes closer to the present, that's when the story became more and more fragmented. But what was also happening at this time is he was slowly becoming a crystal meth addict. So he was starting to lose his long-term memory was intact, but his short-term memory was dissolving, and the text itself dissolves. And I think what's important is this story is not just Shaji's story, but it's really a story about disenfranchised people, disenfranchised groups, underworld characters in Hong Kong, who are disenfranchised, politically as well, and financially. They might get a small stipend if they are legal refugees, but that stipend is not enough to live on. Moreover, they don't have work visas to work, so they have to generate economy somehow. And this was Shaji's way to generate that economy, even though he was here illegally because of problems in Pakistan that involved him defending the rights of a woman who was being what do they call it in India, Eve teased by dacoits, another word used in India. She was the recipient of, I guess you would call, near molestation, or she was being stalked and molested by somebody, and Shahji spoke up for her, resulting in his house being shot severally during salat, during prayer, when the imam is on the mosque, so it wouldn't be heard. And Shahji responded in kind, and that's why he had to leave the country. Editing is really important for me with this text I'm using here, because basically I had about 12 hours of recorded voice that I wanted to reduce into what would be about 4 hours of recorded voice. And you want to do justice to the voice you've recorded. But so really I'm trying to just be a master arranger, because it's his text, it's his voice, he's speaking, but I need to I need to somehow sculpt it or edit it into a self-contained story that is sensible to the reader, without me putting my voice in at all. But my voice really is what your voice is editing. What do I cut out? What do I omit? And am I doing injustice to what really happened by omitting things? I mean, is the real story the stuff that gets cut out because we're trying to manipulate the narrative to make it look to make it read in a certain way? So you see that often on news programs now. Instead of just recording the news, they show the cameras sometimes. The camera comes in, so it looks like it's more authentic, because they're giving you that double level, which is called remediation. And this is something Andy Warhol was toyed with, I think in 1968. He has a film called Andy Warhol Films Jack Smith Filming Normal Love. Right. So Jack Smith makes this film, Normal Love, which was quite pornographic, and audiences did not like or could not really respond to, given cultures of morality in the U.S. in the period. But Andy Warhol turned that pornographic, sensual text into a much more critical text by showing 2 levels of remove, by remediating it. So you're not seeing normal love, but you're seeing normal love sort of through the eyes of Jack Smith seeing normal love, but then also through Andy Warhol's camera. So you have those 3 degrees of remove, which is compelling to show the processes of editing, to show the processes of what you do as an editor. And for me, that was like a big challenge for the text, because it's like, is this, can I just record somebody and then say it's my book? All right? When I just record him? I mean, it's his book. But then, no, I play a big part, just like making a found poem, where you take pieces, what Walter Benjamin called pearls, from different pieces, and you cut them out, and then drink a bottle of wine, put them on the floor, and mix them and make a cohesive poem out of it, or narrative out of it, which is sort of what I'm doing with Shahji. But I still need to preserve his integrity, because as I talked to you guys earlier, I don't want to be reappropriating him for any kind of particular purpose that I would foist upon the text. So I think it's still my text, but it's also his text, and negotiating that. I mean, when you edit a text, you want to show what really happened, right? But you want to cut out the boring stuff. But what makes it boring, or what makes it relevant or irrelevant, that's kind of the battle, and that's where the artistry, I think, comes in. And even in that process, here I am trying to transcribe his voice, which isn't always fully clear. And then it takes a long time to transcribe. So, it ends up being where sometimes I'll listen to 5 or 6 lines, and then, it's memorially there, and then I'll transcribe them. And I know at this point, after doing it for, say, 15 hours, I kind of know what words he will use, or what misconjugations he will use. If we can even say there's a correct conjugation anymore in kind of a global English. So then I start to speak like him, and I'm able to listen to for a minute and then transcribe it. And how much is now suddenly me editing him, even in the transcription, And I think the real point being, we never escape editing the subject we're writing about. And my goal is to try to remain as close to truth as possible, even though I don't believe in a concept like truth. I always put question marks around truth. Because I'll tell my students, and my students, 85% female, I will tell them, if it was 1920, 85% of you, all of whom are female, would not be allowed in this room because you're too stupid to go to university. Just like you were too stupid to vote, just like you were too stupid to drive cars, and that was the truth, right? So truth changes, and I think that's why the 60s are so important, because we start to widen the lens of truth to include underrepresented or minority groups and give them voices and choices as well. I just want you to see what the text looks like, and I just have 2 pages. This is like the end of my introduction. I don't want to really read Shahji's words because I don't like to appropriate his words into my voice. But I will read my introduction to the text, some of which I've talked to you about already. And I just want you to see what the table of contents, and then just to see what the text actually looks like transcribed. Because what I do is I write justify the margins instead, so it looks more like Arabic or even Chinese writing, which you often read from the opposite side. What I had thought of doing is even turning the words backwards. So, you know, you could spell stamp backwards, so the S-T-A-M-P. But I did not want to annoy my readers too much, right? Although I think it would have become very readable very quickly had I done that. But just to allow you to have a better look at how the text appears. And you can see the table of contents.
What's happened to him now?
He returned to Pakistan. When did we last see him, Margaret? January? A year ago. Yeah, 14 months ago. He is on Facebook, however, so sometimes we do communicate. And perhaps it's his real name on Facebook. I'm not sure. It's not Shahji on Facebook. He has a Shahji account and another account. So I think he's really into having multiple identities, which might be kind of honest. I think all of us have multiple identities. When I talk to my colleagues or when I talk to middle management at the university, I have a particular identity, which is different from the identity I have with my students, which is different from the identity I have with my parents or with my girlfriend or with yourselves. I think it's almost anytime we walk into a room, we assume the proper codes to define us according to the circumstances that we need to adhere to in that room. And Shahji has that as well. Yeah, he's returned to Pakistan. I think he's doing well. What happened is, I told you earlier about his kind of fall into crystal meth. He ended up going to prison.
Here?
In Hong Kong, and part of it was intentionally to get him off of the drug.
I see.
He served about 8 months. He was off of the drug. He was fat again. Because once he had acquired that wealth or that way to live, that underground lifestyle in Hong Kong, he returned. He came from Pakistan as a fat guy, and then when he was struggling living on the streets, he became a very thin guy. And then when he acquired that wealth, buying rounds of beers for everybody in a bar, on the peak, he could do that. He got large again, and then when he became the crystal meth addict, he slimmed down to the point where his pants are falling off, and he didn't care. Circles under his eyes, shaved head, just did not look like the guy he was, and he was not the guy he was. Did prison, came out. It was okay for about a year, and he started falling back into that lifestyle. So he left to go back to Pakistan to escape it.
That was his own conscious decision.
Yeah, and he'd been 14 years in Hong Kong. It was time to return to the family.
How old is he now?
Seems to be fine.
How old is he?
How old is he now? He was 17 when he arrived, so I guess he's about 34. Okay, so I will read the introduction. As I mentioned before, you do have the second page of it. So here is the author's introduction. But but even then, you see if you see on the first page beside the table of contents, I say I'm writing as Catalino. So I'm kind of doing that Andy Warhol thing. I'm adding another level of remove from the text because I'm presenting this text as nonfiction, as a biographical text. But there are criminal elements in this text. So what I do is I act as though I am a fictional character, Catalino, presenting Jason Polley's text about Shaji to add another level of editorial remove or of remediation. Okay, so here we go. I'll stop qualifying and just read. So this is my arrival in Hong Kong. After a characteristically interminable seeming 18-hour flight to Hong Kong from Montreal via Ottawa and Chicago, I boarded an express train followed by 2 ferries and finally made my wary way to a cousin's place in a remote village on Lama Island. My sweat yet dry, a knock came upon the door. I unlatched it to a mumbled, "Hi, I'm Shaji," as a flaming black smoke billowing hand-rolled cigarette was pressed into my half-open hand. "Welcome to Lama," the black apparition offered, as it disappeared way faster than the ghost of Hamlet's father. So I just arrived, my cousin was taking a shower, and there was a knock. I opened the door, and there's a man says, "Hi, welcome to Lama," and he gives me a cigarette, and he leaves. And so began my at first dubious, then noteworthy friendship with the remarkable, yet by no means distinct, in Hong Kong at least, anti-hero of Cemetery Mishi. That's how I was introduced to Shaji. Always under cover of darkness, Shaji and I would randomly cross paths every fortnight or so. He always produced the same stimulating age of reason gift. He always had a marijuana cigarette. I soon learned always to have a tin of Qingdao beer. He doesn't like red wine because only British people drink red wine, according to him. In my backpack in polite exchange. So he would share the cigarette and I would give him a Qingdao beer. It did not take long, however, for me to realize that his words were the real gift. Both in content and form, his sometimes bombastic, sometimes hyperbolic stories, coupled with their always captivating cadence, the way he speaks, were my true addiction. He came to the same realization. He learned that he was a good storyteller by me asking him to tell stories. Unlike the majority of his putative friends, who range from Occidental professionals to South Asian laborers to local construction foremen, I like to listen to him, not just procure something from him, only to then avoid him. So I wasn't ashamed of him. So his stories became more candid, more honest, and more incredible. They were desperate, yet also hopeful. I couldn't help but be reminded of Driss Ben Hamed Chahardi's A Life Full of Holes from 1964, one of my favorite novels, or literary journalistic pieces, which details the hand-to-mouth survival of a kif, which is marijuana, selling youth in North Africa. The late, last of the beats, Paul Bowles, tape-recorded the memoir of the illiterate Maghrebi-speaking Chahardi in a few sittings. With little editorial intervention, Bowles translated the novel tape to English. So Paul Bowles, this author who also spoke Maghrebi, an American author, recorded just in 3 sittings the stories of this young man, and then he translated them into English and produced this novel. So that's what sort of inspired me. I decided to do something similar with Shaji's non-fictional narrative, only without translation. So instead of turning Maghrebi into English, I'm just letting global English be global English, complete with what we would call, in more standard English forms, his grammatical mistakes. I would preserve them so I could show him. I would record his story and then transcribe it with the generous help of my sister, Krista, directly using his own words, his own international English, adopting creative license only in terms of form, so this, now you guys have the text, in order best to capture his own painful, half celebratory hesitation and reflection. Cemetery Miss You recounts the first year or so of a Pakistani illegal's experiences in Hong Kong. The work begins by detailing the boy man's middle-class experiences in Pakistan before he's all but forced to flee the place after shooting a man severally at point-blank range in the name of family honor. Thinking he's on his way to South Korea, the 17-year-old arrives in Hong Kong with basically no money and basically no English. He's forced to sell his passport, forced to wander the streets barefoot, forced to eat scraps from the garbage, forced to sleep on Tsim Sha Tsui's Star Ferry with only a newspaper for warmth. I should have capitalized Star Ferry. Less than a year later, he's buying rounds of drinks on the Peak, dating numerous Indonesian and Filipino domestic helpers, driving around in a private car, spending thousands of dollars on footwear, and making regular short business trips to mainland China. Shaji, a name adopted by a host of Indian subcontinent illegals and refugees in Hong Kong, tells not only his own story, but also the untold story, or stories, of so many peripheral figures in Hong Kong, figures compelled into unimaginably intricate underworld networks, and not because of ethical unsoundness or suspectness, not because he's a bad guy, not because they're bad people. Instead, these perpetually marginalized and institutionally desperate figures have no other options. Shaji speaks of alterity in Hong Kong, of the otherness we all criminally ignore. So the story really is a story about us, the privileged people. It's not really a story about Shaw and moral implications. It's about our own moral.
Failures.
Pardon?
Failures.
Our own moral failures. That was the word I was looking for. Yeah, I was going to say shortcomings. Yeah, our own moral failures. The story does not end in epiphany, in sudden realization and happiness. The underground lifestyle Shaji adopts for family, for respect. It's a very key word for him, respect. Leads predictably, but still, no less sadly, to yet another life full of holes. The narrative falls apart as Shaji tells it, as only this Shaji can tell it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Beautiful line that Shaji, the character I'm writing about, the character who's talking about himself in this text, Cemetery Miss You. He says, these are his words: when you feel the big shiver through body, and for no reason, it's because the cemetery miss you. So if I can contextualize that in my English rather than his English, you know, sometimes you might suddenly get a shiver through your body, and it's not because you're cold. You don't know if it's not because you had a tremor from a dream or a bad memory, or you've seen a ghost, whether that's literal or figurative. Sometimes you just get that shiver. He says when that happens, it's because the cemetery, the graveyard, is calling you. You know, so it's sort of like, I guess I could have called this graveyard calling you, which would have made more syntactical sense, but I wanted to preserve Shaji's words. Originally? Well, it's a good question. If you were living in Pak Kok Chun on Lama Do, anytime between 2005 and 2015, you would know Shaji, as everybody knew Shaji, because he was the loud figure who provided the drugs for everybody. It's known as the expat island. You know, a lot of people will smoke illegal drugs, right? we wonder about the legality of now, especially in the context of the U.S., where it's been made legal in 5 states now, and it's decriminalized in Canada. It's legal in the Netherlands. Okay,
Yes.
so that's everybody knows Shaji for that reason. But like I said, the first friend I made, the first person I met on Lama, other than my cousin who was in the shower at the time, was Shaji, who knocked on the door, because he was good friends with my cousin Scott, because Scott also was friends with him, not just somebody who wanted to get something from him and then be ashamed of it and hide it. So sometimes he'd cook dinner for Shaji, or the picture I have on this text is a dinner Shaji made for me. He cooks really, really good Pakistani food, curries, and he makes the bread and everything. And it takes him 6 hours to make this. It takes him all day because he has to reduce it to a very good cook, very spicy as I like it, and he gets very good ingredients from Sham Shui Po, Pakistani shops. So he was kind of a minor celebrity figure, and what was interesting is as payback for this, when I got this text, I gave him, I think, 35 or 40 copies to do with what, and he was happy to send even to his parents, He's telling his underworld story, sending it back to his parents, who were very strict Muslims, who do not even drink. And they don't even know he smokes cigarettes, let alone the other things he does. But he was proud that he had a narrative and it was published, and his story might help other people to understand that these are real people too, put into bad situations, and they do what they can to survive, right? So I met him that night, and then like I mentioned briefly earlier, whenever I would see him, we'd just start to talk. I would buy him a beer, we would share a cigarette, and then just develop from there. And then I thought, his stories are so great, I think I can make a book out of this. I had a recorder, and then he would just tell me a story. He's like, okay, I start here. Like you have on the page I gave you, which is following the table of contents, you have the first page, and basically the introduction to the text. I like to see that first folder as kind of a synecdoche, meaning it's like the book as a whole. It's like the center of the text is about bullets. The bullets he uses to shoot somebody, and that's what you call a piece of hashish in Hong Kong. You call it a bullet. A bullet means like 6 grams or so of hashish. So he sells bullets. He came to Hong Kong because of bullets, and then bullets kind of determined his life. So so that's the hashish here. And then, it's just his story. He started from as early as he could. So he just says, I don't really want to read him. I'll just read this page you have. My name is Shaji. I was born in Pakistan, 1983, 15 June. My father named Tafiq, my mother named Adab. I live in Sialkot, Punjab. Born in Muslim family, very nice people. 4 uncles have 4 aunties, grandfather, grandmothers. Then 2 brothers have 2 sisters. Before we lived together with the grandfather. And it's just his story, right? And I change all the names, but he gives me, longer kind of character descriptions of each of them. So I was actually using a Arabic dictionary, because all of these names have meaning in Arabic or in Urdu. So like Adab means like a caring and nurturing woman. Just like the names in Chinese tend to have meanings that you're not too far removed from, whereas in English we're often very far removed from the original meanings, usages of these names. So I was very careful about that too, and I learned a lot. It took a long time, because there are probably 50 characters or 30 characters in this text, so it takes time. Good question, but what's different about different about Margaret Mead is like, she is going to other places. Like Margaret Mead would go to Pakistan and hang out with Shaji's middle class family, whereas I have Shaji here trying to adapt to cultural standards that are different and doing whatever he can to make his way here. just like all of us are doing what we can, whether or not we're from here, we're doing what we can to make our way here. But he didn't have as many options as us privileged people have, right? In the Hong Kong context, just because, for one thing, he was an illegal alien. He didn't have a lot of options. Yeah, I mean, that's why how else if we know somebody beyond like superficial appearance are we drawn to people? It's by what they say and how they say what they say, and it's even more compelling if this person is saying it in a language that is difficult for him or her, but yet very comprehensible to you as the audience member, right? I think that's one reason why the book had to be told, because you can see all of the efforts he has made and more of the tribulations he had to go through just to acquire a medium of communication, and one that is so, I don't like to use the word universal, but so like globally English. I keep mentioning that. It's an English we can all understand, and and maybe it even helps us to get a better understanding of what Urdu is like as a language, because the constructions don't have the syntax that we're typically used to in English. Yeah, but it's fun with Shaji. I'm sure it's been done often, but even then, when I return to the Paul Bowles, I mean, and this goes into more translation theory, I mean, what terminology do you use? We had this excellent exercise when I was in undergrad. This was my second year, first semester, with my professor Paul Upton, who went to Oxford, and he was a big D.H. Lawrence fan, but he had us read Anton Chekhov's short story Gooseberries, and he had us read 8 different translations from the Russian into English, and we weren't reading the Russian, we were just reading the English, but we basically universally in the classroom agreed on which was the best translation.
That's interesting.
Even though we couldn't read the Russian, there was one that was most appealing to all of us. But a great experiment would be like do the same experiment with a class of students in Hong Kong and ask them what's the big English.
Yes, that would be very interesting. Yes, perhaps we should do that.
Yeah, well, I'll leave that to my comparative colleagues because I don't want to step on anybody's toes.
Absolutely not. So I think now we should switch off the recording so we can relax, but not before we thank Jason very much again. Very wide-ranging talk, presentation. We understand this book very much more now, and we look forward to Jason's next book, which has been a very long time coming.
Thank you.